I'd like to thank Reda Oulamin, who invited me to speak today, the Swiss representative Bertrand-Louise Juliette Borsenberger of the Hans Seidel Foundation, and from the Netherlands, Mathis Schroeder, and of course, all of the tremendous panelists this morning and this afternoon, Khadija Riyadi, Mohammed Al-Ghali, Abdelatif Hatimi, and Jeffrey England, among others. I was one of those observers for the elections, and I went to 40 polling chambers in 10 polling stations, I think starting in Douar, Kora, and ending up somewhere on the highway to Fez. And I couldn't even find a petit taxi back, and I had to get a grand taxi. And it was the first time I understood Rabat. It was thanks to the elections I finally, Rabat made sense to me. And observed much of what Jeffrey was talking about. Crisis Group is new to Morocco. I came here as North Africa director in part because the American school here is better than the ones in the neighboring countries to bring my family here. But I cover the zone from Libya to Mauritania, or I like to say from Wahat Siwa to the Fleuve Senegal. So that zone, although I pay close attention to Egypt as well. Crisis Group has never written on Morocco, except that we had two 2007 reports on Western Sahara that are still standard reading on the issue, and I get comments all the time about these two reports, which were appreciated by both sides in the conflict. And we covered Morocco in a regional report on Islamism, again, a few years back, which was one of our best reports ever. I'm going to make a few reflections related to the Arab Spring and how the West is viewing the Arab Spring, and look forward to the debate from the audience here. Consider this text adapted from Wikipedia. The revolutions arose from such a wide variety of causes that it's difficult to view them as resulting from one coherent movement or social phenomenon. Numerous changes have been taking place in society through the first part of the century. Both liberal reformers and radical politicians were reshaping national governments. Technological change was revolutionizing the life. A popular press, extended political awareness, and new values and ideas such as liberalism, nationalism, socialism had begun to spring up. There was an economic crisis and economic hardship, including drought and crop failures that produced hardship among rural people and working urban poor. Large swaths of the elites were discontented with royal absolutism. 4 factors were involved: the widespread dissatisfaction with political leadership, the demand for more participation in democracy, the social demands of the working classes, and finally the regrouping of reactionary forces based on royalty, aristocracy, and the army. Tens of thousands of people were killed and many more forced into exile. The only significant lasting reform was the abolition of an absolute monarchy in one country. Was this 1989, 1968, 1919? No, it was 1848, a world historical moment that most historians are now comparing to this Arab Spring for a number of reasons. It was called the Spring of Nations, or alternatively, the Springtime of the People. And it spread to 50 nations, mostly in Europe. It was the first and only Europe-wide collapse of traditional authority, but within a year, reactionary forces had won out and the revolutions collapsed. The Communist Manifesto was published at this time in February 1848, and that led to another paper by Marx and Engels calling for changes that were in some ways in sync with and in some ways quite far from where the revolutions ended up. Professor John Owen from University of Virginia wrote a much-discussed piece in the New York Times in January of this year called Why Islamism is Winning, and spoke about the 1820 to 1850 period as very similar to the one we're in now. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were populist revolts that led to the installation of the best articulated and best organized political ideology of the previous generation. In this case, it was populist revolts that put in place a liberal set of governments. In this case, John Owen argued, it's a populist set of revolts that's bringing in an Islamist set of governments. Again, so the previous generation's better articulated and better organized discourse and movements of contestation, taking advantage of a revolutionary moment that's happening for other reasons. The result of these protests were constitutional monarchies. In Belgium, which still exists, the one in France, which ended with the revolution of 1848. But all of this to to let us think that, A, revolutions' consequences need not follow from the causes. Second, to quote Benedict Anderson, even revolutionaries inherit the wiring of the old state. Third, that even though countries may be very different, what happened in the Arab Spring and in the springtime of people in Europe is that the movements were brought together as an articulation of an old order against a new order, even though they didn't fully succeed. And then the quote I hope to leave you with, and I'll bring it up again at the end of the talk, a quote from William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize-winning writer. The past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. One of the most surprising aspects of what I'm talking about in terms of the Islamist victory was what just happened to Adil Imam in Egypt, currently still under prosecution, although he was absolved from some charges for his movies that were against Islamism. And one of the ironies is the two films in the prosecution, one of them was Irhab o Kebab, which was a film I was already using in some of my speeches in the U.S. and North America about the Arab Spring because I thought it was a great metaphor for what the Arab Spring has created. For those of you that don't know the film Irhab o Kebab, basically an angry person takes over the Mugama building in the center of Cairo. A weapon, when the police come to arrest him, falls in his hands, and he's taken over the Mugama building. And the whole society rallies around him, and they're controlling the government in Tahrir Square, and they have a big discussion, like in the movie Big Chill, very revelatory of their innermost struggles and everything. And at the end, they can only decide to order out for kebabs. So they order out for kebabs, have a great meal, and at the end, they realize they've taken over the government, and they don't know what to do with the new power. And so they don't know what to do. So they decide to release the hostages. So they release the hostages into Tahrir Square, and the government storms the building, and there's no one there. And I think this is sort of one of the interesting things about times of revolution is you have these sort of ironies within ironies. A similar irony was the soundtrack of the Tunisian Revolution, El General, this rap song, where in the song, which came out in late December, early January, in the middle of the beginning of the Tunisian Revolution, the rapper predicts his own arrest and torture. Then the Tunisian government arrests and tortures him, and then release him into the middle of the and this rap song becomes Rais al-Bled, becomes one of the soundtracks of the Tunisian Revolution, and it has a big impact on the Arab Spring. It was sung in Bahrain in the protests and elsewhere. So it's sort of ironies within ironies here of the cultural struggle as it lines up with the Arab Spring struggle. We are in what historians call a world historical moment, where history accelerates. And it's happening so quickly that we're missing a lot of it. The Arab Spring hit 18 countries in the Arab world. There were pretty much only two that weren't affected, the UAE and Qatar. And the Qatar played a huge role in the Arab Spring. So basically you're talking about UAE. One senior analyst from Council of Foreign Relations in Washington went to several of the countries and said, including Qatar, and he said, I met the one dissident in Qatar, and he said he was happy, but he could be happier. But other than that quip, I mean, Qatar and UAE was spared, but most of the countries were hit very hard in a way that in any other year, if what happened in any of the Arab countries happened alone, it would have been front page news on the scroll in the 24-hour news. We've been watching it constantly, but much of what happened in the Arab Spring we missed because it was drowned out by other more violent things happening in the Arab Spring. That said, this was, like the springtime of the peoples in 1848, violent. They talked about 10,000 dead in Europe in 1848. We're up at about 39,000 dead across the Arab world for the Arab Spring. 26,000 in Libya, pushing 9,000 in Syria, over 800 in Egypt, a couple hundred in Tunisia. I mean, this was not just civilian uprisings of people against states. This was a violent confrontation, including in Morocco, but not on the scale of the other countries. And the reverberations will go on for years. The latest one, Mali, you have 60,000 refugees from Mali in Mauritania alone. I mean, the ampler of the sort of domino effect of these Arab Springs will continue and is continuing in quite a dramatic way. In Morocco and in much of the coverage of the Arab Spring, the understanding was mostly around the idea of people against regimes. And in Morocco, that peaked in the March and the June protests of last year. But the other element of the Arab Spring, which I alluded to earlier, was people against people and regimes against regimes. And if you really want to understand the context of the Arab Spring, you have to understand the country-to-country dynamics of how countries are benefiting from or not, and seeking to protect their interests in the Arab Spring, and also not. I talked about this at length in a lecture I gave at MIT. You can look up online. It's called Days of Rage, Dreams of Trespass.